Hello, everybody. This is Gynarchic Awakening here. I'm going to do what can only be described as a set of videos. What the fuck? Did that actually happen? It did, didn't it? Gotta make sure that it's good. It's not kind of going down. It's actually the topic of the video, which is balance. Um, More specifically, this is going to be explaining the Gynarchic perspective on balance. I want to make it clear that there are different kinds of perceptions of what it means to be balanced. And the reason why these perceptions exist is because of pre existing notions and beliefs that people have, observations that people have made over the course of their lives, what they have seen, how they've translated their thoughts and their beliefs into actions, and so on and so forth. So before I get to the Gynarchic perspective on balance and why this perspective is, in my view, the more sound and correct one, first you have to understand what balance is. And the problem with the balance, with the patriarchal viewpoint on balance, will be elucidated shortly. But first, balance is as simple as, like, if you go back to mathematics, if you've ever heard of something called static equilibrium, the idea is that there is an object, like for example, this melatonin bottle, that for instance, if I put this bottle down here, the normal force or the weight of the bottle is there's the normal force of the table pushing up on it, and then there's the force of gravity bringing it down. And what ends up happening is these two forces, they sort of cancel each other out, and that's why you observe this bottle in front of me not moving. Now, what is so interesting to me about the concept of balance is that balance is usually thought of in reference to like two different things, right? Like, for example, when it comes to the individual, to be in balance, like if you're on your feet, right? The idea of balance is that you're able to stand, you're not moving this way or that way, you're not tilting, you are where you're supposed to be. And likewise, other forms of balance can be thought of, like generally balance is usually considered within that context. So it's sort of a difficult thing for me to explain because I have struggled in my life to try to maintain balance and peace within myself, which isn't easy. But I would say that if it came to something like this, balance is usually thought of as an interaction between two individuals or two philosophies or two concepts that cancel each other out. Um, and it is often because of this limited viewpoint on balance that we have, as a species, I feel, have gotten into so much trouble. And the reason why is because if you're only thinking about life in terms of two forces that cancel out, like this is part of the problem with our species. We don't think about how that interaction itself, the interplay between these two forces, affects everything around them. This can actually be seen very visibly in a very more commonplace example where you have two men on the street, they're engaging in a slugfest. They're trying to punch each other out until someone is either unconscious or dead. And for instance, there could be a woman coming by who she had experiences with domestic abuse and violence growing up. She could see this incident and it could trigger a severe case of PTSD or some other kind of serious nervous system response that could then compromise the person's health and well being. This is just an example of how limited the viewpoint on balance is, and at least according to the common conception of it, or the common way in which it's viewed. And that's because, generally speaking, we're not thinking. Like, for example, when I'm thinking about this pen, right? right? What are your thoughts, right? You're thinking about gravity and this finger, right? So this finger has to maintain this. But what else is actually going on here aside from these two forces? For example, do you notice how if I change the finger, it changes things, it changes where the pen is, right? Um, Now the finger is the only thing holding together as well as the hand, right? But what about my stomach? What about my heart? What about my head, my hair, right? These are all part of who I am, and these are, things that are in a way attached to this. Like this part of my body, at least for now, it's inseparable from this part or this part. Now, this is a concept that sometimes flies over people's heads, but it's the idea of interconnectedness. That even if you're not seeing it, that there are many different things that are connected to an interaction between two forces, um, or are affected by the interaction between two forces. We don't always think in these terms because many human beings have what are called narrative brains, where it's like him versus me, uh, us versus them. Once you've established a narrative and you're running with a narrative, you are no longer engaging in a healthy form uh, of expression of the human spirit. You have consigned that to something far, far worse. And what balance means for, in this sense, like the kind of balance or this concept will play into what Gynarchic balance is actually about. Because it differs very strongly from this notion or traditional notion of balance that many people have come to consider and accept. And this is one of the things that ends up playing its way into the patriarchal notion of balance. And the reason why this form of balance is dangerous and has always been dangerous is mostly because of the severe emphasis on focusing solely on the interaction between the two opposing forces, one attempting to dominate the other, and not understanding all of the surrounding damage that they're doing, not only in the moment, but to the future, what they are essentially giving rise to, with this behavior, with the violent behavior, with the destructive tendencies. So, how I would define patriarchal balance is it's a blind need to think of things in terms that we must always have a force to cancel another force. This is the entire predication, right? The idea of having a military, or using violence to can the notion is always that, well, we can't leave ourselves defenseless. We always have to be able to defend ourselves from some kind of outside force, right? But at the same time, we can't be everywhere at once. We can't know everything that's going on in the world. And so there's always going to be these unknowns that people are going to play around with in their head. Now, I would actually argue, in some respect, that while patriarchal balance, in a sense, does exist, what it is it's a perverted form of balance that was given credence by male philosophers, by people who have supported these existing systems and who don't see the long term consequences, or at least the vast majority of them don't. A few of them did, and they understood what this would lead to. Um, for instance, one of the big problems with rationalizing violence as a solution to problems is that people end up using violence for their own purposes. They don't have to be violent to protect someone or even to protect something. They could just want to destroy all life on the planet. They could just want to do whatever it is that their selfish impulses drive them to do. And oftentimes we have seen throughout history that there are people who are in these military organizations who manipulate these institutions and use them in such a way to push their nations into war. Sometimes it's false flag operations, it's pre-false, it's a pretext. Uh, these are common ways that we see that this idea of balance, the idea that if we must always have a force to oppose, a force to oppose another force. This idea, when it's seen through a patriarchal context, or rather, it's imbued into the patriarchal context, is that to some extent, violence must always be rationalized or seen as necessary. But the thing is, if you're operating under the notion that what you're doing is self defense when actually you've been lied to go to war and kill people, if you think that you're defending your nation, but what you're actually doing is killing innocent people, then where do you draw the line, when it comes to human beings? If you can manufacture your own reality, and if you can think of self defense as violence and violence as self defense, then don't the two become indistinguishable? And see, this is where the problem, this is one of the things I've always had a problem with when it came to the current system was, as long as you could convince people of an opposition, of an opposing threat, then they will frame things in such a way to where they think they're doing good by their society, or they're doing the right thing. Now, it's interesting that they say this, because what this does, right? And you see throughout history that whenever there's a world war, whatever, there are people who come out victorious and there are people who lose. And at the end of these conflicts, you see that, okay, there is a group of people who are causing violence, invading other people, and then you have another force that opposes that. And then, if their idea is basically that if two nations are not waging war, there's balance. That's basically it. Their idea of balance is not to try to change humanity and move it away from violence and in destruction and towards peace and balance, towards a more permanent equilibrium. It's kind of like the idea of this, right? I would describe patriarchy, if in a nutshell, like patriarchal balance is something like this. Like, it's like, imagine that this is war and this is peace. It's always kind of doing this thing. It's always like teetering and tottering. The pen will never be completely full. And the reason why is because while people are trying to maintain peace, these other assholes over here are taking advantage of certain elements, certain naivete, certain ignorance, taking advantage of the youth, to try to pull people into conflict. And of course, when things go on long enough and there's enough damage, eventually, a conflict stops because people die. So for a time, it kind of switches back over. Now, the patriarchal idea of balance is that there will never be a day without war. There'll never be a day without armed conflict. And the assumption made is that human beings will always be violent, will always rationalize violence as a solution to problems. So there should always be an opposing violent form. So that's why it looks like this. It's like it never settles, it never it never rests. In other words, peace, equilibrium, the balance is never maintained indefinitely. So it's kind of like a push and a pull, a tug of war, so to speak. I'm trying to keep track of it. I think I'll just go on to part two.